Well, thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me to talk to you this afternoon. As I'm an historian, my approach to the topic of bridging science and spirituality will be historical through a study of the personal evolution of Annie Besant. And I'm going to translate because that was not in the original text. Merci beaucoup de m'avoir invité à vous parler ici cet après-midi. Comme je suis historienne, ma perspective sur le sujet du lien entre la science et la spiritualité sera une perspective historique et une perspective historique à travers l'étude de l'évolution personnelle d'Annie Besant. Well, Annie Besant's personality is much too rich and complex to be summed up in a couple of words. However, my biographical research has led me to think that she was first and foremost an intellectual and a scientist in the way she envisioned, she explored, and questioned the universe, including in its spiritual dimensions. Annie Besant's life was just one long quest for truth, and in fact, she ended her essay, Why I Became a Theosophist, on these very famous words, I asked no other epitaph on my tomb, but she tried to follow truth. Well, I think she became conscious of a quest for truth at the time of the intense spiritual crisis she went through during her disastrous marriage. And she spent the rest of her life trying to solve this. From then on, the truth she sought was a scientific truth that could account for the nature of the universe and of man, and that excluded the supernatural understood by Annie Besant as anything going against natural laws, known or as yet unknown. This is one of the reasons why she rejected the Bible, for she could no longer believe in what she considered as a supernatural revelation. However, Annie Besant worshipped truth, and even as a proclaimed atheist, she expressed her scientific beliefs in terms of faith. Annie Besant's faith in science was such that she believed even ethics could be based on scientific laws, that there existed a natural order which logically dictated duty, and that evil could eventually be eliminated. Well, knowing this, I'll explore with you today the reasons why Annie Besant recalled that as soon as she read The Secret Doctrine, she believed, I quote, the very truth was found. Why, to her, theosophy, as defined by Madame Blavatsky, was perfectly compatible with the scientific view of the universe. For Annie Besant never abdicated reason for emotion or even pure mysticism. Well, let's focus first of all on her education. Annie Besant was lucky, but was it luck? Was it destiny? Well, she was lucky in that very early she met people and circumstances that enabled her to develop her intellectual abilities as well as scientific curiosity much further than what the Victorian society allowed to a young lower middle class girl. The first influential person she met was Ellen Marriott, a wealthy single woman in her 40s who decided to educate little Annie, who spent 5 years at her place in Dorset. In her autobiography, Annie Besant recalls at length the education she got at the hands of Ellen Marriott, who was an intelligent, well-read and cultured woman. Contrary to most Victorian teachers, she did not believe in the virtue of learning lessons by rote, and she encouraged Annie and a few pupils to be creative. Most importantly, She taught boys and girls exactly the same. All of them were taught Latin, French, German, history and geography, and all of them had to do some needlework while she read aloud to them. This explains why Annie Besant later was unimpressed, to say the least, by male authority, and she never believed women were intellectually inferior. However, when she reached 16, she found herself in a dead end. In the early 1860s, higher education was still an exclusive male preserve in Britain. So, if she wished to go on with her studies, Annie had no other choice but to do so by herself. Aware of this, and also of Annie's intelligence, Ellen Marryat taught her how to study alone in a well-organized and structured manner. 20 years later, Annie Besant still expressed her gratitude to her in her autobiography. I quote, "No word of mine can tell how much I owe her, not only of knowledge, but of that love of knowledge which has remained with me ever since as a constant spur to study." So, Annie Besant was largely self-educated, but her married life proved terribly frustrating from an intellectual point of view. She found herself at a loss among the wives of the teachers of Cheltenham College, where her husband taught mathematics. In a sarcastic way, she recalls in her autobiography those, I quote, "ladies who talked to me only about babies and servants, troubles of which I knew nothing and which bored me unutterably, and who were as uninterested in all that had filled my life, in theology, in politics, in science, as I was uninterested in the discussions on the housemaid's young man and on the cook's extravagance in using butter when dripping would have done perfectly well, my dear." End of quote. Well, in her autobiography, Annie Besant recalls the path that led her to lose her Christian faith. The religious doubts she had first experienced just before her marriage reappeared all the stronger when her little daughter fell dangerously ill. However, Annie Besant's spiritual crisis was also fed by her renewed interest in science. What happened was that Dr. Winterbotham, their family practitioner, seeing how depressed Annie Besant was, decided to lend her some of his scientific books to get her mind off theological broodings. Needless to say, this completely backfired. For Annie Besant then decided to put all Christian beliefs to the scientific test. She said, I quote, "I resolved to take Christianity as it had been taught in the churches and carefully and thoroughly examine its dogmas one by one, so that I should never again say, I believe, when I had not proved," end of quote, meaning here proved in what she considered as a scientific way. And as, at that time, she was still unable to make a difference between religion and spirituality, she doubted the latter because of the dogmas of the former. Well, Annie Besant had to work for a living after she separated from her husband, and she first became a writer for a free thinker named Thomas Scott. The essays she penned then confirmed how much she loved studying and doing research. There were very, very few places where a Victorian woman could study, to the notable exception of the reading room of the British Library, then within the British Museum. Women had access to the whole catalogue except for a few so-called obscene books. But the reading room also was an intellectual, meeting and debating place. Annie Besant thus joined a prestigious line of female thinkers who made the best of this opportunity, from George Eliot before her to Virginia Woolf after her. She spent days there reading Spinoza, Darwin, John Stuart Mill or Auguste Comte. Annie Besant went on with such reading and researching when she joined the National Secular Society, because she had to review many scientific books for the National Reformer, the NSS paper. And she also translated German scientific essays into English, such as Ludwig Buchner's Force and Matter. In fact, spreading scientific knowledge was part of the fight the National Secular Society was leading against religious dogmatism and superstition. The NSS had even called their London headquarters the Hall of Science. Very soon, Annie Besant became one of the most of their lecturers as well as one of their vice presidents, so she had to keep track of all the contemporary scientific discoveries and theories. Nevertheless, she was not self-taught by personal choice. So, when University College London opened their degrees to women on equal terms with men in 1878, she immediately decided to matriculate. And here I agree with a student of mine who did a master dissertation on Annie Besant's studies. And Manon Gozard, my student, said in a master dissertation that Annie Besant's decision was part of her, I quote Manon, her unceasing quest for answers to questions about the world and human beings. Well, in order to be allowed to attend degree courses at UCL, Annie Besant had to pass exams in 5 subjects, including mathematics and at least one in science. She was tutored by Dr. Edward B. Aveling, a professor of anatomy at King's College London, as well as a secularist and a socialist. Annie Besant matriculated just after she lost custody of a daughter, and she recalls in her autobiography, I quote, "I found it the very greatest relief to turn to algebra, geometry, and physics and forget the racing legal struggles in wrestling with formula and problems." Beyond this, obviously, getting a science degree would also give more legitimacy to her scientific assertions as a secularist and as a woman. Annie Besant easily passed the exams and she matriculated in 1879. She decided to study for a science degree and she registered to as many classes as she could in the London institutions affiliated to the college. My student Manon Gozard noticed in her studies that Annie Besant was most anxious to put her theoretical knowledge to the test, and that she took, in fact, quite a number of experimental science classes, some in very, very practical fields. Annie Besant studied sound, light, and heat, as well as electricity and magnetism at Birkbeck College, but also biology, animal physiology, botany, and mathematics in various other institutions. This very comprehensive list shows a scientific curiosity that went way beyond a mere wish to graduate. Annie Besant proved a brilliant student. At the end of her first year, she got first-class certificates in such demanding subjects as chemistry, mathematics, magnetism and electricity, botany, biology, sunlight and heat. Manon Gozard found out that the botany exam, just to take one, the botany exam of 1881 included 5 subjects: vegetal histology, morphology and physiology, systematic botany, and the structural and physiological characters of the principal natural order of the vegetal kingdom. And Annie Besant took this 6-hour-long evaluation on paper, followed by a 6-hour-long practical examination, and she got a first-class certificate that was the only one among all second-year students of botany in the whole of Britain that year. Unfortunately, during a third year, UCL authorities, fearing for their reputation, decided to prevent Annie Besant from graduating. She was banned from some classes, including botany classes. The lady superintendent of UCL, to whom she complained, just told her, "There is some prejudice against you." Annie Besant managed to summon an extraordinary general meeting. Over 100 people attended, students and professors, including the influential Professor Thomas Huxley, who had fiercely supported Darwin and in fact invented the word agnostic. Yet, even he approved the Council's resolution to exclude Annie Besant. No precise reason was officially given, but it may easily be inferred that it had to do with her publicly defending women's right of access to contraception during a notorious trial a few years before, following which she had published her own well-researched essay on birth control. Clearly, UCL feared Annie Besant's notoriety, who tainted the reputation of the institution as well as that of the other female students, hardly any of whom, by the way, supported her. Well, Annie Besant never managed to take her science degree in 1883, but she had become a qualified science teacher as early as 1880, when she had passed advanced certificates at South Kensington. Annie Besant taught science classes for 8 years at the Hall of Science of the NSS to students who prepared for those very same South Kensington exams. She taught weekly classes of up to 30 students, young men and women, in such topics as elementary animal physiology, advanced chemistry, sunlight and heat, or electricity and magnetism. And she also published short textbooks on the topics she taught. Annie Besant's students, their results proved that she was an excellent science teacher. In June 1881, the National Reformer proudly announced that among the 14 students in elementary physiology, 2 had obtained a first-class certificate. And the following year, out of the 9 students to whom she taught sunlight and heat, 8 out of 9 also got a first-class certificate. Okay, so we've established that Annie Besant truly was a scientist, but we still need to understand how she managed to reconcile science and spirituality when she converted to theosophy. So let's have a look at the broader context here. Because Annie Besant was far from being the only Victorian who suffered from the agony of religious doubt in view of contemporary scientific discoveries and theories. Well, at the beginning of the 19th century, most British people still considered that faith and science agreed. Oxford and Cambridge were Anglican universities, they were religious universities, and half of their students went on to become clergymen. And the science teachers also were clergymen. The science teachers taught natural theology, that is, God's work in this world as observed by reason and experience, as opposed to theology revealed by the Bible. Nevertheless, as early as the 1830s, the Victorians began to wonder about evolution and natural laws. Geologist Charles Lyell published his Principles of Geology in 1833, in which he explained that landscapes had been formed by slow natural processes such as erosion, and those processes were still at work. And he concluded that the Earth was much older than could be inferred from Genesis when read literally. Another geologist, Robert Chambers, published Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation in 1844, a book which was a bestseller. And in fact, we know that Prince Albert read it aloud to Queen Victoria when she was pregnant. Well, she was always pregnant. But, Chambers developed a theory of transmutation, according to which everything from the solar system to man had evolved from older forms. Chambers still believed in divine intervention, which he called the first cause as the origin of the whole process. So this is the reason why his essay was also well accepted. But thanks to him, by then, to most Victorians, the question no longer was, do organisms evolve, but how and why do they evolve? So, contrary to a contemporary myth, Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species was not a complete revelation. Darwin, who has been turned into a sort of secular prophet, was actually part of a large field of research. Darwin had defined his theory as early as the 1830s, well, basically just like Chambers, and he only decided to publish it when young Alfred Russel Wallace foolishly sent him his manuscript showing he had come to the same conclusions. Never do this. On the Origin of Species was much discussed, but it was not as subversive as it was later considered to be. Indeed, Darwin only dealt with the origin of species, not of life. So to the Victorians, he had not killed God, just pushed him further back the way Chambers had before him. Darwin talked of the evolution of man only 12 years later in The Descent of Man. Once again, the essay was much discussed, but some reactionary debates and cartoons hide the fact that the majority of Darwin's readers accepted his conclusions, to his own surprise, by the way. This is the reason why, far from being ostracized, Darwin was buried at Westminster Abbey when he died in 1882, right by Isaac Newton. Annie Besant read Darwin very early on, and she immediately believed in his theory of evolution. But by then, only the most evangelical British still read Genesis literally, and they were a small minority. Most of the late Victorians considered the Bible as the symbol of spiritual truth that was compatible with the latest scientific discoveries. So, one should really keep a critical distance with positivist historians who insist on some intellectual and scientific Victorian figures' spiritual crisis. Many Victorians were indeed worried by the diminishing importance of religious faith in their society, and they discussed this at length. But those who completely lost their faith, such as Annie Besant, remained a tiny minority. They were not representative. University professors Frank M. Turner and Timothy Larson also showed in their studies that, contrary to a positivist historical vision, many Victorian agnostics later experienced a reconversion either to Christianity or, like Annie Besant, to another form of spirituality. But anyway, we may wonder if she really was an atheist from 1874 to 1889. Well, at first read, Annie Besant seemed to conform to the definition of the scientific atheist. She remembers in her second autobiography, published after she converted to Theosophy, I quote, "The overmastering sway which science was beginning to exercise over me drove me to seek for the explanation of all problems of life and mind at the hands of the biologist and the chemist. They had done so much, explained so much. Couldn't they not explain all? Nevertheless, she sounds much more qualified in her essay published in 1875 on the nature and the existence of God. Her conclusions actually correspond to agnosticism as defined by Thomas Huxley in 1869. Like him, Annie Besant only asserts that man cannot know anything about God, including if he exists or not. I quote, "We have reached a region into which we cannot penetrate. Here all human faculties fail us. We bow our heads on the threshold of the unknown." End of quote. So Annie Besant, in fact, only rejected the anthropomorphic view of God, but in this essay, a definition of matter partakes of vitalism and even of immanentism. I quote, "Thus we identify substance with the whole comprehending and vivifying force of nature. The deity becomes identified with nature, coextensive with the universe, but the God of the Orthodox no longer exists." End of quote. So, her conclusions, although she defined herself as an atheist, her conclusions went way beyond scientific or philosophical materialism. She develops instead a form of transcendentalism that she expresses in an almost mystical way, in which science already appears as a new spirituality. I quote, and this is still this essay from 1875, "Study nature's laws, conform to them, work in harmony with them, and work becomes a prayer and a thanksgiving, an adoration of the universal wisdom, and a true obedience to the universal law." End of quote. So it is not surprising then that as early as 1882, that is 7 years before Annie Besant converted to Theosophy, Madame Blavatsky wrote in The Theosophist, I quote, "Another lady orator of deservedly great fame, both for eloquence and learning, the good Mrs. Annie Besant, without believing in controlling spirits, or for that matter in her own spirit, yet speaks and writes such sensible and wise things that we might almost say that one of her speeches or chapters contains more matter to benefit humanity than would equip a modern trained speaker for an entire oratorical career." Well, and anyway, Annie Besant soon wondered about the limits of Victorian scientific knowledge, and she rejected all dogma, including scientific dogma, as she expressed in 1889 when she explained a conversion. It's a very famous quote, and I really like it. She said, "Refusal to believe until proof is given is a rational position. Denial of all outside of our own limited experience is absurd." End of quote. So, from the 1880s, Annie Besant explored supranatural phenomena, but always from a rigorously scientific point of view. She sums up this state of a quest for truth in her second autobiography, in which she recalls her frustration. I quote, "Fact after fact came hurtling in upon me, demanding explanation I was incompetent to give. I studied the obscure sides of consciousness, dreams, hallucinations, illusions, insanity. I added spiritualism to my studies, experimenting privately. I read a variety of books, but could find little in them that satisfied me. I experimented in various ways, suggested in them, and got, to me, some curious results. I finally convinced myself that there was some hidden thing, some hidden power, and resolved to seek until I found." So, the reasons why Annie Besant eventually converted to Theosophy were actually part of the very same scientific questioning that had led her to lose a Christian faith 15 years before. And reading her second autobiography, one realizes that there was no real, sudden, mystical revelation. It is as an intellectual and as a scientist that Annie Besant converted to Theosophy. In fact, when her friend, the famous journalist and spiritualist W.T. Stead, received a copy of Madame Blavatsky's The Secret Doctrine to review in his Pall Mall Gazette in May 1889, he gave it to Annie Besant because he knew of her exploration of the fringes of Victorian science. And Annie Besant recalls what happened in her second autobiography. I quote, "Home I carried my burden and sat me down to read. As I turned over page after page, the interest became absorbing. But how familiar it seemed, how my mind leapt forward to presage the conclusions, how natural it was, how coherent, how subtle, and yet how intelligible." True to herself, however, Annie Besant immediately put this first impression to the test of a scientific intellect, although she acknowledged how powerful her intuition had been. I quote, "The effect was partially illusory in one sense, in that they all had to be slowly unraveled later, the brain gradually assimilating that which the swift intuition had grasped as truth." Well, to Annie Besant, any true definition of the nature of the universe had to be grounded in scientifically proved principles such as natural laws, causality, and evolution. Well, in Isis Unveiled, Madame Blavatsky had described science and theology as two conflicting titans, between whom the Victorians were crushed to the point of losing belief in man's spiritual dimension. But to her, the ancient wisdom, as studied and promoted by theosophists, could meet the challenge of modern science. And in fact, Isis Unveiled was subtitled "A Master Key to the Mysteries of Ancient and Modern science and theology. Blavatsky was very clear about evolution. I quote, "Modern science insists upon the doctrine of evolution, so do human reason and the secret doctrine." End of quote. She accepted Darwin's theory, but she rejected Huxley's belief that all life had originated in matter. To her, as to Annie Besant, evolution need not imply materialism, but immanentism. And Annie Besant soon also came to believe that God gradually unfolded himself through time in an evolutionary process that Victorian science had partly discovered. Annie Besant also came to the conclusion that evolution meant that man was developing natural powers as yet unknown to science. This view of evolution is the reason why she accepted Blavatsky's teaching about the Mahatmas and the occult powers they used to watch over humanity and to pass on the ancient wisdom. To Annie Besant, the Mahatmas were not supernatural beings, but highly evolved beings. As for the law of karma, to Annie Besant, it was the logical spiritual extension of the law of cause and effect once she had accepted the principle of reincarnation. Theosophy, as defined in the secret doctrine, heavily relied on ancient Eastern texts such as the Upanishad and the Veda. However, Annie Besant realized that, unlike the Bible, these sacred texts were not meant to be considered as supernatural revelations, but as the teaching of adepts whom she viewed as part of the natural order. As for phenomena, to Annie Besant, they did not go against the laws of nature, but used powers that scientists did not yet know how to explain. She says in a second autobiography, "Constantly, Madame Blavatsky would remind us that there was no such thing as miracle, that all the phenomena she had produced were worked by a virtue of knowledge of nature deeper than that of average people and by the force of a well-trained mind and will." To Annie Besant, therefore, Theosophy not only incorporated Victorian scientific discoveries such as evolution, but it also went beyond to reveal the metaphysical explanation of these observations which had frustrated her before. This is the reason why Annie Besant, the intellectual scientist, recalls that, discovering the secret doctrine, I quote, "I was dazzled, blinded by the light in which disjointed facts were seen as part of a mighty whole, and all my puzzles, riddles, problems seemed to disappear." In 1907, the year Annie Besant was first elected president of the International Theosophical Society, she gave a series of lectures in London that can be considered as a manifesto. This makes it all the more important when she asserted in one of those lectures, I quote, "HPB did not give a body of teachings to be swallowed, to be taken on authority, to be accepted by what is called faith, but a body of verifiable teachings, facts to be examined over again, facts to be experimented on, to be carefully studied as the scientific man studies the part of the world he knows." In those 1907 lectures, Annie Besant deplored the fact that the Society's third object, that is, to investigate unexplained laws of nature and the powers latent in man, had been neglected, and she called for a renewed focus on that part of Theosophy's mission. I quote, "Therefore, I would claim for the society its place as a seeker after new knowledge. It seems to me it is a duty of the Theosophical Society not only to deal with the fact that others have verified, but to carry on researches by properly qualified persons among its own members to utilize its magnificent theories, its knowledge." Yet, she made it very clear in this lecture, I quote, "There is nothing miraculous or supernatural, but everything is the orderly product of nature working along definite lines," end of quote. And she insisted on a scientific point of view and method. I quote, "You must try in all psychical research, in all weighing of observation of phenomena, to cultivate the purely scientific spirit, indifferent save to the truth and the accuracy of the results, not seeking for facts to verify a doctrine already believed in, but seeking for facts in order to draw conclusions from them as to the laws and truths of the unseen world." Well, by then, her view of science had come to incorporate ancient and Eastern science. As early as 1898, in a series of conferences entitled Evolution of Life and Form, Annie Besant gave a clear definition of the difference between ancient and modern sciences, both of which she had already considerably explored. I quote, "The fundamental difference between ancient and modern science is that the first studies life and sees in forms the expressions of life. The second studies forms and tries by the process of induction to find out if there is an underlying principle by which the multiplicity of forms may be explained. The first works from above downwards, the second from below upwards, and in that very fact is the promise of a meeting place where the two will join hand in hand." In this conference, 1898, Annie Besant called for the ultimate union of ancient and modern, Eastern and Western sciences, so as to revive on a solid scientific basis, I quote, "the olden times when religion and science were wedded together and there was no discord between the intelligence and the spirit," end of quote. As a leading theosophist and a scientist, Annie Besant considered this one of her most important missions. To her, the bridge between science and spirituality had been broken with, I quote, "religion on the one side suspicious of science in its progress, science on the other hand apt to be proudly contemptuous of religious claims." Annie Besant then described, still in this conference, the ancient type of scientist whom she clearly considered as an ideal that she herself hoped to emulate and whose method of investigation she used. I quote, "He has to study life, not form, and for such study he must evolve himself, the life that is within him, for only life can measure life, only life can respond to the vibrations of the living. His work is to unfold himself, to bring out of the depths of his own nature the divine powers that lie hidden therein, not in the senses but in the self. His investigations can only be carried on by means of these powers. So, Annie Besant developed a method of investigation based on yoga and meditation so as to induce astral travels and clairvoyance, and she put it into practice with Charles W. Leadbeater. The result led to two major essays, Thought Forms, first published in 1901, and most importantly here, Occult Chemistry, subtitled A Series of Clairvoyant Observations on the Chemical Elements, first published as a book in 1908. According to E.P. Sinnett, who revised the essay in 1919, some of Besant and Leadbeater's clairvoyant discoveries were validated by those of the Russian chemist Dmitry Mendeleev, who had devised the periodic table, and of Marie Curie, as well as Sir William Crookes. Well, I'm not competent to verify Sinnett's claims about Mendeleev and Curie, I'm afraid. But what I know is that William Crookes himself was favorably impressed by occult chemistry. William Crookes was a highly respected British chemist and physicist and a member of the Royal Society. He had discovered thallium in 1861 and helium in 1895, and he worked on uranium and radioactivity. But Crookes also believed that science had a duty to study unexplained phenomena. So he had joined the Society for Psychical Research, even becoming its president in the 1890s, as well as the Theosophical Society itself. In 1989, B. Alan Wallace published Choosing Reality, a contemplative view of physics and the mind, based on his doctorate thesis. Almost 1 century after Annie Besant, this scientist also called for a way, I quote here his introduction, to transcend the split between science and religion by seeking parallels between insights in modern physics and in mysticism. The method of scientific investigation he advocated is strikingly similar to Besant and Leadbeater's, for he also looked to the East. I quote here Wallace. Other cultures, such as those of classical India and Tibet, have devised alternate approaches entailing the refinement of human consciousness as a means of empirically investigating physical reality. If we go back in time 1 century, we notice that Annie Besant was extremely well read in her contemporary science. For instance, in Evolution of Life and Forms, she said, "It is very significant that some of the greatest problems of modern science are now turning on the nature of the atom, and that scientists are asking, what is it? Is it matter or force? Is it a particle or a vortex?" This is 1898. Never will that question be answered with certainty until man has developed in himself the power to respond to the life that thrills in the atom. End of quote. From a Western point of view, she can be considered as a visionary, anticipating modern and quantum physics, when she wrote, still in 1898, "Everything depends on vibration. The universe is made of vibrations." I remind you that Albert Einstein's general theory of relativity was first published in 1915, and quantum physics developed from the 1920s. Her questionings and conclusions still proved valid almost 1 century later, when they were taken up by quantum physicists Friedrich Capra in The Tao of Physics, first published in 1975 and subtitled An Exploration of the Parallels Between Modern Physics and Eastern Mysticism. To me, and this is very dear to me, in the same visionary but almost poetic way, Annie Besant even anticipated the discovery of the double helix of DNA by over 50 years, when she said in this same conference, Evolution of Life and Form, and it's a beautiful paragraph, she said, "I have read in an ancient book of a mountain, which is the emblem of stability, of an axis around which everything is to resolve. A mountain thrown into a mighty ocean. And I have read of a great serpent turned round that mountain in spiral coils. On the one side, the Suras are pulling, and on the other side, the Suras are equally busy. Between the two, the positive and negative of modern science, evolution is started, and the serpent spiral begins to turn round and round that axis." So, to me, retrospectively, Annie Besant herself appears as the seer when she writes, I quote, "The seer who, looking at the ocean of matter, described pictorially what the eyes of the spirit beheld there. But far from rejecting," this is her words, "the dry scientific statement of the modern thinker, she considered that in such instances," and this is the title of this conference, "the seer and the scientist have met. I'd say they met in Annie Besant, that she personified through her life and her quest for truth the bridge between science and spirituality." Thank you.